So I was asked to talk as a TED Talk, right? So here we go. Imagine you wake up in the middle of the night and the water level is rising in the floorboard. You grab your family, you grab your keys, and you leave. And by the time it's morning, you lost everything. Now imagine that you're recovering from substance use disorder. Not only have you lost your home, but you have also lost the stability, privacy, and the routine that was keeping your life together. Unfortunately, this is something that is happening often, and we can do something a little bit better. We often treat floods, housing, and health as separate problems, but the communities in the Appalachian region are facing all of them at once. The Appalachian region covers 13 states, all the way from the south of New York all the way down to Mississippi. It is also an area that has suffered years of disinvestment. And it is also an area that, when I speak with my colleagues, it also faces, when a flood comes, is one of the areas that faces the highest drug overdose deaths in the nation. So there is a correlation between all of these events. So when we're faced with such a challenging problem, we cannot solve this in silos. I'm an engineering design professor here at Penn State with affiliations in architectural engineering and civil and environmental engineering. And I lead the Dream Structures Lab. The Dream Structures Lab stands for the design of resilient, engineered, autonomous, and multifunctional structures. And for the last 15 years, we had looked at how we can make buildings and bridges safer against the extreme events, from earthquakes to tornadoes to hurricanes and flood events. So, what do we do to tackle this challenge? Well, we could develop the technology, but if we don't have the buy-in from the community or the industry, then it just stays in the lab. So we partner with various faculty members at Penn State, and we did what we all could do, right? Talk to the community, listen first. This is called community-centered design. We went to Charleston, West Virginia to discuss the local barriers, but also their strengths. What are we doing in this community to help solve this very complex challenge? What are the recovery housing solutions for those that are recovering from opioid addiction? Or climate resilience on the housing. Now, this might be the first time you're hearing about recovery housing, so let me explain it to you. If you are trying to recover from some form of addiction, you go to a treatment center, and then right after you're done with the treatment, you cannot just go back to your community because they don't know if they can trust you. The families may not receive you right away. So there's a place called transitional housing where you stay there for 6 months or 12, and it's more than just housing. It's about gaining independence, right? It's workforce development. What are the different programming that could be helpful for that person to move into independence? So that's what we did. We went to the source. Fahe is a network of 50 plus nonprofit organizations throughout Appalachia, and they connected us to RCCR, which turns hope into homes. And together we developed this workshop, and we worked and talked to the community there. So these are our 5 focus groups of 26 participants. We also had engineers, architects, we had social workers, we have learned about affordable housing, workforce development, community development, and what are the needs that this community is going through. We have a full day of learning with 10 main questions, but these are some of the highlights that we are asking, right? What are the strengths and weaknesses of recovery housing? How does extreme events impact the recovery housing in West Virginia? How might future events, what are we doing to prepare? And specifically, what is the vision moving forward? How do we tackle and leverage what is already ongoing and working in these communities? What did we find? So our rural sociologists of a team with a group of students, we started looking at accessibility. They mentioned transparent policies, they mentioned programming. They also mentioned spaces that feel like home, that are also energy efficient, private spaces, but also abilities to integrate residents' families, as well as third spaces for hobby spaces. So what you see here is they're not describing a building, they're describing dignity. So how does extreme weather challenge that vision? Well, recovery housing, there's usually an area that it doesn't receive a lot of funding. So the houses that are affordable are usually placed in a floodplain, which means there is also an area that if it gets displaced temporarily, the services are also not available because the entire community is trying to recover after a flood event. So it's a big, complex challenge. So again, going back, we go looking at Charleston, West Virginia, with our community partners as well as industry, and then we look at the areas that are of interest. So through conversations with our community partners, we have identified an area of the west side of Charleston, West Virginia, and in communication with the city of Charleston, they have identified 80 houses that are interested in demolition as well as abandoned, and then we identify 8 properties that they want to redevelop by 2030, in the next 5 years. So with that information, we continue the conversations because we realize that the houses that survives is the one that we want to have, right? Because as a civil engineer, I feel like when people are inside this, you're not doubting that the building is going to shelter, right? So that's exactly what we want to make sure we do. So our students are not looking at hypothetical assignments, they're helping solve a real community challenge. And our architect in the team has developed some incredible renderings in communication and feedback from the communities, identifying the 4-bedroom spaces, the places where they want to meet. And these are different rendering spaces that are intended so that we can get community feedback and community input to make sure that we're addressing the actual needs. So what is the innovation? Our innovation is on smart amphibious housing. So instead of resisting the water and not updating and having to upgrade and lift the house every single year because the code keeps changing that, what we're proposing is designing homes that move with it. So we are lifting the house as the water floods, and then it brings it back down when it's over. What is interesting is that this is a technology that already exists. It's already been implemented around the world, and we have invited Professor Elizabeth English to give a talk last semester. And what we learned is that there are still barriers to be solved. This is still not part of the FEMA code. This is still not part of the standardizations. There's still policies, zoning requirements, so on and so forth. So our goal is to bridge that gap. And this is not science fiction. This is a design decision. So we're looking at structural analysis, load combinations, and most importantly, we're trying to leverage the existing IoTs. We're looking at sensors, water levels, structural health monitoring, energy systems, and also the ability for modular expansion. We're looking at simulation of flood propagation with real data so that we can actually model and predict what's going to happen if a flood event were to happen. So the real innovation is not one floating house. Is it a framework that communities can use to build resilience together? It is a model that could be replicable throughout Appalachia. It is flood-prone communities. It is also identifying the correct workforce development opportunities for these communities. And it's also strengthening the university community innovation partnerships. Because we often ask whether communities can recover after a disaster, but maybe we should ask a different question. Why are we still building communities that cannot adapt? Because if a house can rise with water, maybe communities can rise with them too. I want to thank the team that has brought these activities together, including Daniel Whisler on the experimental side, Lisa Iulo and Hammond Center for Community Co-Design, Kristina Brant on rural sociologist, an expert on SUD recovery, who has worked closely with Professor Zhen Lei from rural economics to make sure we're leveraging good, effective solutions. Our team from the Harrisburg campus, including flood mitigation expert Shirley E, as well as Truong Tran, who has looking at the analytics and machine learning for this approach, as well as make sure that we're doing, working with Professor Mutunga, making sure that when we're looking at flood prevention, we're also looking at the health impacts of it. We wouldn't be able to do this without our community partners, from RCCR to Fahe, and our industry, who, especially Chuck Thompson, who serves as an advisor from the civil engineering perspective, and Bruce Decker, who has helped us a lot, especially during the facilitation of the workshop. And last but not least, of course, the student team, who are leading this effort. We have architects, we have architectural engineering, aerospace engineers, and civil engineers in the team continue to tackle this challenge. And with that, thank you. Any questions? Yes.
How are you redesigning the MEP? And then if you're thinking about it from a flood perspective, temporary power solutions, are you solving for that too, right? Just have power usually goes out, the house might rise, but power lines down. So are you looking at those two things?
Yes, that's an area that we're of course very interested. Some of the previous solutions have looked at, self-sustaining power. That's one of them for sure. Some of the solutions that we have right now that have implemented amphibious housing is usually for temporary. They usually don't have the people in there. It's just for an ADU unit or something that is temporary where you're maybe holding something, but people are not necessarily there. So that's definitely an area that we're looking for, especially when we're trying to look at stability and using sensing systems for doing that. So excellent question, thank you. Yes?
I have a two-pronged question. One is, how do you justify building in a floodplain? And number two is, how do you justify this type of expenditure and in what type of market? Because usually these types of markets are sub-cost markets.
Excellent, thank you for your question. So a couple of different things. One of the things that I do in my lab as well is field deployments after a disaster. So we go on the area and look at what happened, try to learn if the code is still up to date. So one of the things that I found is that some of these areas in Louisiana or in Texas or things like that, every time there's an event, they look at the water line and they say, if you're gonna rebuild, you have to go higher, right? And that can be extremely costly. And if my house survived, why do I have to tear down my house and now you have to build a new one, right? So one of the other needs that our community needs is ADA accessibility. So when you have your house lifted, then that's also not feasible if you're in a wheelchair, right? So some of these technologies is something that we believe it could be a potential for this. Some of the houses that are speaker, and that's why I brought up this house, is because you see it's just, they have buoyancy blocks underneath the house. So a lot of this technology is similar to some of the floating houses technologies. It's just that it hasn't been necessarily implemented for this case study. I'm not sure if, can you repeat your other question?
The question is the cost. How do you justify the cost of the expenditure? And who funds the additional cost? Because it costs money to do a lot compared to building a flat
I see.
ground.
So the way I'm looking at the cost is at the long term, because if you tear down a house and build it again, that's more expensive than if you have a house that is able to survive the event. And it's also, if you're looking at, we mentioned, carbon emissions. If you look at how much a disaster creates waste, every time you have to tear down, that's waste, but also if you have to build new houses, you have to get new materials. So when you're looking at it from that perspective, that's where the initial investment at the very beginning to make it more resilient in the long term, it makes sense. But that's definitely an area that once we have the technology functioning, because right now we want to make sure that the standards make sense, that we have the code, and everything can be upgraded, because as long as we continue to provide solutions that are resilient as an option and not necessarily mandated by the code, then we continue to have the same problems. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's rather comment than question as a follow-up to this conversation now. I'm thinking that it's also a woody disruption in my area. Finance is such a definition time value of money, which includes lost opportunity of whatever you cannot do over time with money, but with lives as well. So eventually somebody lost all the belongings, all those intangible things. I'm not even talking about how distressed they are
Yes.
I appreciate the correlation, between floodplains and recovery. Was that actually correlated with your research? Was that previous research?
We can only do it because Iulo gave us the seed money to get started. That's the reality, because this is something that has been dear to my heart because I've been working with these communities for years, submitting proposals that never get funded. So this gave us the opportunity to start working on it. And for that, we're very thankful because with that money, we were able to go to the communities and actually start listening to what their needs are, what's working and what's not working. And that has propelled to further conversations with our capstone teams and just making sure that our problems are real and not necessarily imaginary. Yeah, thank you for your question. Do you have another follow-up?
I do.
Sorry.
Last one.
Sounds good. My understanding of floodwaters, it is the rising level, but it's also static pressure, right? Because we have to worry about flowing water. I just didn't know if you took static pressure into consideration from a structural standpoint.
Yeah.
In addition to the rising.
Beautiful. Thank you for your question. The good news is that we also have a poster. So our students are going to be able to show you the SAP model and looking at how they're accounting for wall debris impacting the side of the wall, the buoyancy forces and the hydrodynamics and all that. I was trying to keep it TED Talk, so I was trying to avoid any equations. And I'm sure we can all talk about this a little bit more later. Thank you so much, everyone.